You think you know pirates. You picture the cutlasses, the eye patches, the chests overflowing with Spanish gold. You see the glint of rum in their hands. But the true, terrifying currency of the high seas wasn't gold, silver, or even rum. It was a clear, tasteless liquid, the thing your body cannot live a week without. The deadliest enemy a pirate faced wasn't the Royal Navy's cannon, but a scorching thirst that drove men mad, turning loyal crews into cannibalistic ghosts. Tonight we're sailing into the brutal, desperate world of maritime survival, where the most precious thing on the ocean was everywhere, and yet utterly impossible to drink. The year is 1720. The air over the Bahama Channel hung thick and still, like a woolen shroud. Not a breath of wind disturbed the surface of the sea, which was a vast, unforgiving sheet of polished turquoise, reflecting the sun's merciless glare. On the deck of the Sea Serpent, a schooner of modest size but infamous reputation, the world was shrinking to the confines of a blazing wooden box. Silas the Quill. Thorne wiped the sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of grime and salt. Silas wasn't a fighter. He was the ship's master gunner and, more importantly, the unofficial ship's chronicler. A pirate who could read and write, a rarity. He squinted at the horizon, a shimmering, mocking line where the endless blue met the endless white. The Sea Serpent had been becalmed for 8 days. 8 days under a sun that felt less like warmth and more like a forge hammer relentlessly striking the deck. And every day, the same terror grew, the water casks. A week prior, Captain Ironjaw Rourke had ordered the rations cut to a single pint a day. Now it was down to a half pint, served only at sunset. The crew moved with the sluggish, deliberate pace of men already partially dead. Their skin was dry, their lips cracked, and their eyes held a haunted look of frantic internal obsession. "Gunner!" Rourke's voice rasped, the sound like crushed shell. The captain was a hulking mass of muscle and menace, but even his iron will was visibly eroding. "Check the storage again, and I swear, if you find a drop more than I know of, you'll drink it all at once." Silas didn't need to check. He knew the countdown to the last drop. The main supply, the butts, the massive oak barrels, were almost hollow. Their sound, when struck, was a hollow, echoing drumbeat of impending doom. They had gambled on a quick raid and a swift return to a resupply island. They had lost. The tragedy of the sea is the deadly irony of salinity. Silas remembered the day a new recruit, a young dock worker named Tom, had been on watch. After 3 days of rationing, Tom had collapsed, delirium setting in. When the crew found him, he was slumped over the rail trying to scoop water from the sea with his cupped hands, gulping it down like a mad dog. Captain Rourke had dragged him back, kicking and screaming, but it was too late. "The sea won't save you, boy," Rourke had roared, his voice thick with a fear only a sailor understood. Within hours, Tom was convulsing, his body rejecting the poisonous fluid. The sodium concentration in seawater, around 35 grams per liter, is 3 times what the human kidney can process. To flush out that excess salt, the body performs a desperate suicidal act. It pulls water from every available source, sucking the fluid right out of your own cells, your tissues, your brain. You think you're drinking to survive, but the salt is literally turning you inside out, pulling the life right out of you. You become, in essence, a walking, shriveling sponge. Tom died that night, not of thirst, but of hyponatremia, a horrific, agonizing death, surrounded by the very element he craved. The memory was a sharp shard of glass in Silas's dehydrated mind. He had seen mutinies over a bad poker hand. He had seen battles fought over a single piece of silver. But thirst stripped a man of his soul faster than any fever or cannonball. It was a cold, quiet form of madness that began with parched lips and ended with the crew viewing one another as a source of liquid. The silence of the becalmed ship was punctuated only by the low guttural coughs of the men and the creak of the empty masts. Desperation became the father of invention. The crew had already moved into the first stage of improvised collection. Rain and dew traps. When a shadow of a cloud appeared on the horizon, it was treated like a galleon loaded with jewels. "Rig the canvas!" Rourke would shout, his voice finding a temporary surge of energy. The pirates became accidental engineers. They would spend hours setting up complex temporary rainwater collection systems. The largest sails and tarps were stretched taut, angled perfectly, using rope and spar ends to form massive sloping funnels. The critical trick? They had to be clean. Salt residue from sea spray meant the captured rainwater would be brackish and could hasten the spoilage of the precious stored water. They'd use their last bits of nearly fresh water to rinse the canvas, a terrifying gamble. But when the rains didn't come, they turned to the night. Get the hides out! Due duty! Dew collection was an exercise in heartbreaking futility and hope. Thick woolen blankets, or better yet, cured sheep hides were laid out overnight. The material would absorb the condensation from the humid air. At first light, before the sun could burn off their harvest, 2 men would take each hide and with trembling hands wring out the moisture into a small ceramic bowl. The yield was pathetic, maybe a few ounces per hide, but it was pure, sweet water. Silas remembered the taste. It was the taste of survival, a fleeting moment of clarity in the surrounding ocean of madness. Their greatest struggle wasn't collection, but preservation. The ship's barrels, the wooden butts, were their floating treasure vaults. But wood, Rourke had often lectured, was a living thing. Fresh water poured into a raw oak barrel quickly became a vile, slimy concoction. The wood pores, having previously held rum or beer, absorbed the liquid and began to rot internally. Bacteria and algae thrived in the dark, moist, stagnant environment, turning the water into something that smelled like a sewer and tasted like moldy socks. Silas watched the carpenter, a grizzled, cynical man named Finn, working over a sickly green barrel. Finn had witnessed crews die not from thirst, but from water poisoning. It was a captain out of Port Royal, Captain Rourke, Finn had explained years ago. He was a desperate fool, tried to save money by using old beer casks for his water. They drank the stuff. It was like drinking liquid plague. He lost half his crew before they even saw an enemy ship. The solution came not from science, but from the brutal logic of alcohol. Whiskey and rum makers had long known that storing spirits in burnt casks improved the flavor. But pirates realized the charring did more than just add a smoky note. Silas detailed the process. Controlled fires were lit inside the empty butts. The flames were allowed to lick the interior, leaving a thick, black layer of charcoal. This wasn't merely a layer of ash. It was a rough form of activated carbon. When the fresh rainwater was poured into these charred barrels, a transformation occurred. Filtration. The porous carbon layer acted like a natural sponge, trapping the larger organic impurities and sediment that caused the water to turn rancid. Inhibition. More importantly, the charcoal slowed the growth of the microbes and bacteria that feasted on the stagnant water. The water stayed clean, clear and drinkable for weeks longer. The Sea Serpent had 2 dedicated charring crews. It was a tedious, dangerous process, but Silas knew the simple blackened ring inside the oak barrel was worth more than all the gold of the Spanish Main. Water meant life. Life meant plunder. The charred barrels solved the problem of storage, but the Sea Serpent was still surrounded by a deadly, hostile sea. The ship was dying a slow death under the sun. "We need a still," Rourke announced one evening, spitting a mouthful of dry biscuit over the rail. A true one, not that slop pot we tried 3 years ago. The pirate still was the ultimate gamble. It required fuel, precious wood that could be used for cooking or repairs, and it carried the constant, terrifying risk of fire on a wooden vessel in the middle of nowhere. Rourke ordered Finn, the carpenter, and Silas, the literate gunner, to oversee the construction. Distillation, the fire-forged freedom. The principle was simple: boil the sea, catch the steam. The cauldron. They used the largest copper cooking pot they possessed, securing it over the central galley fire pit, which was now fueled by salvaged, rotting deck planks, fuel they couldn't afford to lose. The coil. The steam needed a path and a cooler. They melted down a collection of stolen church altarpieces, a cynical, fitting use of plunder, into crude copper tubing. Copper was chosen not by design, but because it didn't rust in the sea air and transferred heat efficiently. The condenser. The coiled tube was run through a bucket of seawater to keep it cool, As the hot, fresh water steam traveled through the chilled copper, it condensed, turning back into liquid water. The harvest. This freshly distilled water dripped, drop by precious drop, into a waiting storage jar. The work was exhausting, the process heartbreakingly slow, a cup an hour if the fire was perfect. But the water that came out was pure. The salt was left behind in a crusty residue at the bottom of the copper pot. Silas remembered the first taste. It was flat, sterile, and glorious. It tasted like nothing. And when you are dying of thirst, nothing is the taste of heaven itself. Despite the charring and the still, a constant low-grade illness plagued the crew. The water that wasn't salty was often stagnant, leading to cramps and diarrhea. Rourke's health was deteriorating faster than anyone's. One day, while rationing the last bit of decent water from the main butt, Silas noticed something strange. The barrel was old, a salvaged prize taken years ago from a Spanish man-of-war. At the bottom, amidst the dark, sludgy sediment, a few forgotten pieces of eight, thick, tarnished silver coins were resting. Silas filtered the water from this barrel. It was clearer. It smelled better. He remembered a conversation with an elderly African cook on a slaver ship he'd sailed on years ago. The cook had sworn by the practice of leaving a silver shilling at the bottom of the drinking water keg. "It keeps the bad spirits away," he'd whispered. Silas, the pragmatic chronicler, now saw a different kind of magic at work. He spoke to Rourke. "Captain, the silver. We need to put the silver into the water." Rourke, his mind hazy from thirst, laughed a dry, hacking laugh. "You want to waste our plunder on superstition, Gunner? Are you mad?" "It's not superstition, Captain," Silas insisted, his voice low and urgent. "Look at the barrel, it's cleaner. I don't know the science of it, but the water is better. It's the coins we took from the Infanta." Rourke, desperate for any edge, agreed. He ordered 10 Spanish silver reals, thick pure coins, to be dropped into the 2 remaining water butts. The accident of antibiotics. The change was not immediate, but it was undeniable. The silver-treated water remained clearer for longer. The crew members who drank from it reported fewer stomach issues. What they had stumbled upon was the power of colloidal silver. Silver ions, Ig+, released in tiny amounts by the metal, are oligodynamic. They attach to the cellular walls of bacteria and microbes, disrupting their metabolism and halting their ability to reproduce. In essence, the pirates had invented a crude, centuries-ahead antibacterial agent. The silver was the ultimate backup plan. It was a preservative that worked silently, non-stop, without fuel, fire, or constant attention. The coins, previously valued for their purchasing power, were now valued for their purifying power. They were the true treasure of the sea. They were recycled, retrieved, and tossed into every new barrel of collected rainwater. The sun rose on the 11th day of the becalming. The still had broken the day before, a leak in the copper coil, and the sky remained an empty, mocking blue. The silver helped, but it couldn't create what wasn't there. The half-pint ration was distributed, watched over by Rourke, who now carried his pistol in his belt, not for enemies but for his own men. Silas saw the look in the eyes of Jethro, the largest man on the ship, a former English soldier. Jethro had been Rourke's most loyal man. Now his eyes were bloodshot and his mouth was a dried, panting cave. "Captain," Jethro slurred, his voice shaking, "I'm telling you, there's a spring over the port side." Rourke followed his gaze. There was nothing but the heat haze, the devil's mirage that dehydration conjured, a shimmering distortion that looked like a running stream. "There's nothing there, Jethro," Rourke said, his hand slowly drifting to his pistol. "Yes, there is," Jethro screamed, his voice breaking into a maniacal shriek. He lunged, not for a weapon, but for the water bucket that Rourke's steward held. It was the oldest story of the sea. Not greed over gold, but madness over water. The mutiny of the thirsty. Rourke fired the pistol, not at Jethro, but into the air. The sound cracked the silence. "The man who touches the barrel before I say so," Rourke roared, pointing the gun at Jethro's head, "will be drinking the sea." Jethro froze, the animalistic rage draining out, replaced by shame and utter defeat. He stumbled back, defeated not by the captain's pistol, but by the thirst that had already claimed his mind. Silas knew the ship had less than a day's worth of water left. They had used every trick. The charred barrels, the silver, the dew collection, the broken still. As a last, desperate measure, Silas ordered the men to bring up the citrus and vinegar stores, the preservative cocktail. He had the crew mix the remaining few gallons of water with a generous portion of rum, enough to inhibit bacteria, but not enough to intoxicate, and a full cup of vinegar. The acidic nature of the vinegar helped stave off microbial growth, and crucially, its sharp taste masked the metallic, foul flavors of the rotting barrel water. It was a terrible drink, but it was prescribed survival. As the crew slowly, reluctantly drank the foul, sharp-tasting cocktail, Silas sat by the rail, watching the sky. The tension was a physical thing, suffocating. They were days from land, out of fuel, and down to their last, bitter drops. And then, as if commanded by the desperation of 100 dying men, the horizon changed. A dark, bruised line appeared, low and fast, not the heat haze, not a mirage. "Sailors!" Silas croaked, pointing. "Look! A squall!" The wind hit the becalmed ship like a fist. The sea serpent groaned, the sails snapped, and then, with a sound like tearing silk, the rain began. Not a drizzle, a torrential, tropical downpour. Rourke, forgetting his dignity, began shouting orders, his voice renewed by a flash of hope. "Rig the canvas! Now! Every sail! Clean the barrels! Get the funnels out! We drink tonight!" The crew, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten, moved with a speed that belied their dehydration. Tarps were unfurled, sails angled, and the pure, blessed water of the sky began to stream down into the waiting, charred and silver-lined barrels. Silas stood on the deck, letting the rain wash over his face, soaking his parched lips. It was cold, clean, and tasted like freedom. The sea serpent did not find any gold on that voyage. Captain Rourke and his crew limped back to port, their holds empty of treasure but their barrels full of water. The experience cemented a brutal truth that spread through every pirate fleet in the Caribbean. The greatest captains weren't the best fighters or the cleverest navigators. They were the water masters, the accidental scientists who knew that a piece of charred wood and a tarnished silver coin were the only true guarantees of life. The gold brought pleasure on land, but the clear, tasteless liquid brought them the right to sail, to fight, and to live long enough to chase the treasure one more day. And that, for a pirate, was everything.